focusing on Africa, and public policy focusing on poverty and housing. Dr. Beard's research centers on African political development. She has spent a great deal of time in Kenya and has language experience in Swahili and German. Professor Beard graduated with a BA from Calvin University and an MA and PhD from Michigan State University, all in political science. As a side note, Dr. Beard is a long-distance runner and has completed many marathons, including the Boston Marathon 3 times, and is also a certified level 1 CrossFit trainer. It is my privilege to welcome Professor Virginia Beard.
Okay. Good morning. I have to say, when I was at Calvin, it was Calvin College, not Calvin University. And I still call it Calvin College. So today, what we're going to be listening to in the film and discussing is the role of China in African states. My research focuses primarily on sub-Saharan Africa. So in my part of the presentation, that is what I will focus on, is continental-wide issues, and then any specifics would be about sub-Saharan Africa. So we're going to go ahead and start the film and watch that. Afterwards, I'll give a brief presentation with some facts about what China's role in Africa is that builds on the film, and then we'll have question and answer. Sound good?
Great, thank you. And for those of you at home, I'm just going to ask that maybe Jean can unmute again to confirm that you're hearing this video. So I'm going to go ahead and share this. I'm hearing it.
From South Africa to Ethiopia, from Nigeria to Kenya, the whole continent of Africa is under construction. New dams, highways, ports, bridges, and railroads are springing up. And many are bankrolled by Chinese cash. Great Decisions investigates how American policymakers are responding to China's presence in Africa, explores how the COVID-19 pandemic is affecting China's ties to the continent, and asks how African governments can navigate the increasingly bitter rivalry between Washington and Beijing. Competing interests, the US and China in Africa. Next on Great Decisions.
Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Herford Foundation, PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP, and the Nelson B. Delavan Foundation.
Roberts International Airport, the main gateway to the West African nation of Liberia, was in dire need of refurbishment.
Finally, that shame that we all, and we do feel shame when we land at the airport, and the plane is just going, you know.
But cash-strapped Liberia could not afford the $50 million price tag to renovate the passenger terminal. So Liberian officials made the same decision as their counterparts in countless other countries across Africa and around the world. They turned to China.
I was the liaison between the president's office and the Chinese embassy. And one of the projects we ended up doing with the Chinese was the rehabilitation of the terminal at Roberts International Airport. What I would say about the Chinese process is how fast it is. The speed with which we can negotiate a deal is really important.
The same pattern has been repeated in nearly every African country.
There is hardly anywhere in Nigeria that you go to today that you don't see the visibility of China in terms of infrastructural projects. You see that they are constructing or remodeling projects from the airport to roads to hospitals to everywhere.
Ethiopia borrowed about 1.3 billion for the Addis-Djibouti railway. Kenya borrowed 2 billion for the rail lines. Those are incredibly huge projects and much needed infrastructure development in Africa.
Now, American policymakers from both parties are speaking out about the need for the U.S. to counter China's rapid expansion in Africa.
China is not at all blind to the fact that there's a Southern Hemisphere, and they're making huge investments in Africa. They have a lot of resources on the table. I think we need to make sure we put the resources on the table. We need to step it up.
Just reducing our investment provides, of course, opportunity for other players to step in. Other players that have more efficient governments than we do, albeit not very transparent and not very virtuous governments like China. We have to be really careful. I always say I'd rather invest in the peaceful tools of feeding hungry people and infrastructure development and healthcare and energy than in the weapons of war.
For 4 years, the Trump administration put America's global rivalry with China at the center of its foreign policy.
It's clear to me that the United States is concerned about China, that Africa is part of that. When the United States released an Africa strategy a few years ago, it was primarily a China strategy. And if you look at the comments that the then National Security Advisor Bolton made when that strategy was released, it was mostly about China.
China uses bribes, opaque agreements, and the strategic use of debt to hold states in Africa captive to Beijing's wishes and demands.
I think in the case of Africa, the Chinese have made extraordinary efforts to increase their influence. So I think it's perfectly legitimate for the US and European countries to be worried about what China's up to there. I think China's pursuing a very, very long-range strategy. And I don't think the United States for many years really had any coherent response.
But US policymakers face a difficult question: how to counter China at a time when American politicians have little appetite to spend money on foreign aid.
The United States will no longer provide indiscriminate assistance across the entire continent without focus or prioritization.
Essentially, what Ambassador Bolton was trying to lay out was that the U.S. is going to target its funding towards key countries and particular strategic objectives. We, the U.S., need to get back in the game, but it's very difficult to get back in the game while also focusing on reducing the amount of development assistance to African nations.
U.S. officials are counting on the American private sector to make up the difference.
Taxpayer investment in Africa should incentivize other generosity. I think to the degree we can, we ought to work with our private sector partners to get them to go into Africa and help solve problems and make investments.
Let's marshal all of the power of American economic might in Africa and elsewhere, not just state resources, but also the resources of American private sector that promotes entrepreneurship. It promotes economic development, not just reliance upon the government that's writing a big check.
You simply cannot fill the void with American private investment going into the continent. I'm all for American private investment. I would like to see a lot more of it. But even our exports to Africa have not increased significantly in recent years.
I know as a former diplomat that we always wanted American companies to be involved in the countries that we were in, but we also have to think about what American companies are willing to risk. And China sees Africa as an opportunity, and American businesses tend to see Africa as a problem.
Lots of the US firms or European firms don't have the sufficient resources or risk appetite towards Africa. When talking about Africa, the Chinese do have a medium to long-term vision, and sometimes they are willing to take a relatively lower investment return.
In recent decades, Western creditors have moved away from funding large-scale infrastructure projects in the developing world.
Prior to the 80s, one of the biggest funders of infrastructure projects on the continent was the World Bank. So the World Bank had this ideological shift in the 90s to say, we don't do big infrastructure. There was this idea that the state needed to be taken out of economic activity. So what happened in Africa was a huge backlog of infrastructure projects over the years. We were lagging behind in power, in roads, in hospitals.
Now, many African governments in their national development plans, they put infrastructure first. And Western countries, including the US, have invested much less in infrastructure and invested more in aspects related to health, education, governance, promotion of democracy, and so on.
What is the sense in discussing for years to get a loan from the World Bank or from whoever? African countries, people are actually facing a lot of real life problems. People are dying because of poverty. Poverty is being multiplied across generations. So we don't have time to talk about some of these things.
But now, China's expanding influence in Africa has some Western policymakers rethinking the turn away from infrastructure.
I can detect, even with the most reluctant donors and the most reluctant economic partners of Africa, a change of attitude and much more interested on infrastructure, particularly after China has been much more ahead of the curve in terms of providing this type of support.
China has growing influence in Africa because they have a development bank that is willing to underwrite major infrastructure projects. The United States does not have that capacity, and there's no reason that we shouldn't. We can compete with China for economic influence in places like Africa, but only if we put on the table the kind of development deals that the Chinese are.
Yet, despite Washington's increasing interest in Africa, some experts question whether the U.S. is prepared to make the necessary political commitment to the continent.
Since 1990, the first overseas trip every year by the Chinese foreign minister is to Africa. And how many times has Secretary of State of the United States traveled to Africa in the past 10 years? The Chinese are willing to throw in the political capital. They're willing to throw in the economic capital.
Throughout the 90s and early aughts, U.S. policy toward Africa was actually through a prism of development and humanitarian assistance. Africa wasn't seen as a place to do business until the Chinese came. The U.S. has never had to compete, really. But now, you're not the only actor out there.
First case of coronavirus confirmed in Nigeria.
Algeria, 20 cases. Burkina Faso, 2.
Fellow Ghanaians, I took the step to close all our borders.
Egypt, 59.
And I ordered a mandatory quarantine and testing.
Senegal, 5. Togo, 1.
D'un premier cas confirmé de coronavirus COVID-19.
With regard to the situation in Botswana, so far, 14 suspected cases.
This is a global crisis. Delay in action means death.
Without decisive action, the number of people infected will rapidly increase from a few hundred to tens of thousands.
When the COVID-19 pandemic hit Africa in the spring of 2020, Beijing sensed an opportunity. Both the Chinese government and private philanthropists such as the Jack Ma Foundation stepped in to provide critical supplies.
The market for PPE was overwhelmed and there were shortages, so they couldn't really obtain it, even if they had the money for it. So when China provided the equipment or the materials, that was immensely appreciated by so many countries in Africa.
We have received 20,000 test kits from the Jack Ma Foundation and assorted personal protective equipment.
Social media platforms like WhatsApp are incredibly popular on the African continent. During the height of the pandemic, initially what was being sent around was that famous video of the Chinese constructing a hospital in record time. And there were lots of screenshots of Jack Ma's Twitter account that were floating around.
When the PRC sent a medical team to Algeria in April of 2020 in order to help with the fight against COVID-19, the rhetoric and the discourse used then was that this is only a continuation of a practice that has started in the 1960s when the PRC in 1963 sent the first medical team to Algeria. We've seen the PRC providing equipment, but also really accompanying that with the narrative that China and Africa have always been through a lot of challenges together.
As China captured attention across the African continent, some analysts worried that China's generosity might overshadow the support that the U.S. has given over many decades to improve healthcare in Africa.
We've taken note of the very modest financial donations that China and so-called private Chinese entities have dispersed in Africa. China's contributions to fighting the pandemic are paltry.
When you're providing $30 million and supporting the local Ministry of Health, that's good for a 2-paragraph story on page 4 of the local press, and that's about it, and then it disappears. When Jack Ma of Alibaba flies in a plane load of protective gear, you get 4 or 5 times the publicity.
We urge the Americans to use their energy on fighting the epidemic at home. Their attempt to undermine friendly relations between China and Africa will never succeed.
The world is not so transactional as, you give $1 for a vaccine and you get $1 worth of credit, where people are keeping these ledgers. People are keeping ledgers in their minds as to which countries are constructive actors in the international system, which countries give out of a sense of solidarity and a sense of being connected.
I think the United States is doing much more than it is given credit for, and it is extremely important to acknowledge. People will overlook that the United States has been involved with the continent for decades, has been involved in education, in healthcare, in human rights.
In April 2020, Chinese diplomats in Africa were forced to do damage control amid allegations of racism in the southern city of Guangzhou. There, some Chinese landlords had evicted African tenants, fearful that the African diaspora might transmit COVID-19.
There were also stories about restaurants refusing service to members of the African diaspora in Guangzhou, several parks that prohibited the Africans from going in. And so these issues started up a big conversation about racism and about race in China.
China was very quickly put under the spotlight of international scrutiny, and this created much diplomatic problems between China and African countries. In fact, multiple African governments sent their letters of protest to Chinese government. They summoned the Chinese ambassador to lodge their complaint about the treatment of the African nationals in Guangzhou.
It has been very much spread across social media. For those who were very much thinking that, that China is so different from the West on these particular issues, I think this has revealed that there's also a race issue in China, especially towards Black Africans.
But China was not the only country to grapple with concerns about racism in the spring of 2020.
The same way Africans were shocked by the fact that some Africans were poorly treated by some Chinese in China during the COVID-19 pandemic, they were eventually even more shocked by the fact that they were able to witness the police reaction to the Black Lives Matter movement.
Anywhere where Black people tend to be treated badly, it tends to have lots of resonance on the continent. Chinese one was very surprising, precisely because China itself has been trying to spin this story of like, we are your friends, we're Africa's friends. Everybody else who's come before has treated you guys badly, but now we're equal partners. My sense is that the typical African is resigned to expect that kind of behavior from the US authorities towards Blacks.
Now, with African economies strained to the breaking point, both Chinese and Western creditors face urgent calls for debt relief.
What's happened with the pandemic is that African export revenues have shrunk. Most countries in Africa are still reliant on raw material exports for their economies, or things like tourism. These sectors have been hit very hard, and this means that those governments, those countries, don't have the revenues that they need in order to import medicine. They don't have the revenues they might need to import food.
Despite the very close relations between China and Africa, their debt relief efforts so far have been extremely timid. They have been very reluctant to engage through the G20 or other multilateral debt discussion fora. And they have focused on this bilateral type of negotiations.
They particularly have said that they would like to negotiate debt on a country-by-country basis, whereas African countries are trying to negotiate their debts collectively. There's a bit of a feeling that China is ambivalent on its stance.
The latest opinion polls, including an Afrobarometer survey of 18 countries completed in 2020, reveal that ordinary Africans are eager to learn from the experiences of both China and the US.
In your opinion, which of the following countries, if any, would be the best model for the future development of your country? And the United States ranked first here, 32%, and China ranked second with 23%.
It's difficult to know how many African countries really fully understand what is China's model of development. What they do see is a country that has done an enormous job at reducing poverty. They would like to emulate that. That doesn't mean they really understand how China got there.
They've lifted how many hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And so African governments look at that and they think they can learn something from China. The other part of the Chinese experience is that they're run by the Communist Party. It's an authoritarian dictatorship. And I don't think that's very attractive in Africa.
It also remains to be seen whether China can transform its economic clout into widespread interest in Chinese society and culture.
China has been quite successful in building a sense of its own power and utility in that China is a very important economic and political player in Africa, and it can't be ignored across the continent. But I don't think that that's translated into a genuine sense of affection for China.
Not a lot of African people know a lot about China, but more and more that relationship and that image has changed over the last few years, and this is in part due to multiple projects and initiatives that encourage African students and Africans in general to travel to China for scholarships or for long-term trainings.
You now have a situation where Nigerian students are being sponsored to go to Chinese universities to learn things like engineering. The idea is they go to China, learn, and they come back to manage the railway that is being built by China. China is now one of the most popular destinations for African students, surpassing the US, surpassing the UK.
In recent years, more and more Africans have begun to study the Chinese language.
there is a wide variety of interest among African students who wants to learn Chinese. They see that if a lot of projects are being done by Chinese companies and corporations, then it becomes important for them to learn the language in order to be able to secure job opportunities with a lot of these Chinese firms.
Countries like Uganda, Kenya, South Africa include Mandarin courses in school curricula very early. However, the Afrobarometer in its last survey included a question stating which language African citizens consider to be the language of the future. And English largely scored the first rank, and this is not surprising.
China is not a place you go to for some glamorous outing. When folks say, I came back from China, stories are, I came back from China, you won't believe what they have done with their highways. Nobody ever says, I came back from China, I went and watched a great Chinese play. It's a practical country. You know, it's a place that you go to visit to learn about practicalities, not to enjoy life.
As relations between China and the U.S. sour, African leaders must navigate the thorny landscape of what some commentators have characterized as a new scramble for Africa.
Africa ultimately is going to make its own decisions about what is best for them. We shouldn't view Africa as a colonial era chessboard in which we are trying to compete with Russia or China for influence and control. We should be invested in the African people.
I think it'd be really naive to say that there aren't spheres in which China and the United States are competitors, but there are places where Chinese and American interests align. One of those places is development in Africa. So the last thing Africa needs is Chinese-American competition. We don't need that. We've got enough problems of our own.
Today, Africa is home to 5 of the world's 10 fastest growing economies and is poised to double its population by 2050. It is also one of the places most vulnerable to emerging threats and the changing climate. In the decades to come, no matter how the U.S. rivalry with China develops, Africa is poised to take center stage in the foreign policy of both countries.
Great Decisions is America's largest discussion program on global affairs.
Do the technology part. I'll disappear in just a moment. Perfect. Okay, so theoretically, you're not going to see any Zoom control. Okay. If I see them pop back up from where I'm sitting, I might come running in. Okay. So based on what the documentary, the film covered, I'm going to jump around a little bit from the way I had put my slides together as I sat there thinking. So I'm going to start with some history prior to what they gave us in the film. So really, one of the things to keep in mind about China is they play for the long game. They've done that in, say, steel production, right? We used to be steel self-sufficient. Now we're not as a country. China is, based on the way they traded with the United States. They've had the same kind of long game with sub-Saharan Africa. So they mentioned that the first trip that new secretaries of state equivalent in China takes is to sub-Saharan Africa. That goes back to during the 80s. Actually back to the 60s, excuse me. As soon as African states started to gain independence, you started to see the difference between the way the United States and China functioned with Africa, the United States and other Western countries, really, right? We said, we want you to be democracies. Even before there was loans going out, there were conditions on them with the way the United States worked with African states. China's never had those same kind of conditions. So they started going and recognizing and supporting liberation movements in sub-Saharan Africa, late 50s, early 60s. And any African state that would say they supported a one China policy got Chinese support, right? And especially the countries in sub-Saharan Africa that at independence wanted to pursue something along the lines of democratic socialism, right? Like Tanzania and Julius Nyerere. So the pictures up here, the first one is, the picture capture is funny to me, caption, an unidentified African leader was Zhou Enlai in 1963 is the one on my far right. And then former Chinese Premier Zhao Ziyang with Kenyan President Daniel Arap Moi during an 11-nation visit in 1982 to 1983, right as Moi was becoming president, or no, excuse me, about 10 years into his presidency, but right after an attempted coup. And then in January of 2021, we can tell it's COVID days because they're elbow bumping, not shaking hands. During a tour, State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi visiting with the Nigerian Foreign Minister, Jeffrey Onyema. So the current relations that we see go back to these late 50s under Mao Zedong. The first premier of the PRC visited Africa and signed bilateral agreements with several African states. Like I said, they had planned to go to 10 countries and ended up going to 11. And because I forget which country, Tunisia came out and said, we support one China. So China added them to the list and said, we're going to have diplomatic relations with you. So going all the way back to the independence era, China has had this idea of how it would build its relationships with states in sub-Saharan Africa. They would support their liberation. They would support whatever kind of governance the states wanted to pursue. The only condition that China has ever put on states for any kind of bilateral trade aid agreements was you have to support Beijing. You can't support any other claims to Chinese sovereignty. So that is some history and background. And then I put some information on the activities. They give you some overview in there of China's focus on infrastructure. But they've also done, specifically with infrastructure, they showed railroads and roads. They've built government buildings, which is a big deal for governments to kind of show their power, show their prestige. Also trained political parties, which is interesting given ideas of autocracy versus democracy. They've built sports stadiums and hospitals. So they have been invested in the healthcare side, but in more infrastructural ways than the past with the US. So in the comparison with the United States, there was a ton to grab from the film and kind of break apart. Yes, the US has a long history and has done a lot with sub-Saharan Africa, but it's been primarily through, in my mind, a sort of paternalistic view of Northern white saviors helping Black Africa, and through aid and charity, whether it's through the United States government or through nonprofit organizations, foundations, et cetera, right? China has taken a different stance going in. Not that there's not some power differentials and some paternalism involved, but there's been a lot more of at least the way that they frame their relationships with African states, as China says to African states, we're kind of in this together. We're both underdogs in the world. So see us as your partners. And they also have not had any of the kind of conditionalities that the United States and Western countries have put on their relationships with sub-Saharan Africa. That's not to say that everything they've done through these infrastructure projects. So you can see in about 5 years ago, China is more than infrastructure. Chinese foreign direct investment surpassed the United States foreign direct investment in China. And so there's financial investment that China is making along with the infrastructure and trade. And China has surpassed the US because our focus has primarily been on aid and working through the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and the US Agency for International Development. we've not looked at, as the film said, African states as a place to do business and Africans as world consumers, so much as charity cases that need our help, right? And that is coming back to reflect in the way geopolitics between the United States and Western countries and China is relationships with sub-Saharan African countries. We already talked about the kinds of projects being done, coal plants, roads, airports, etc. And initially, the relationship benefited Africa in the forms of some jobs and in lots of infrastructure. And I say some jobs because one thing Chinese companies, like one of the reasons that economists say foreign direct investment and the kinds of plants and companies and infrastructure China was bringing into Africa are good for the local states and local economies, is it boosts the economy, it gives infrastructure needed to get, say, goods to market, but it also brings jobs. China tends to bring their own labor, especially for the higher up and mid-level jobs. When I was in Rwanda in 2008, we went driving and I had spent almost all my time in Africa and Uganda and Kenya at that point. And I was amazed at how good the roads were. The roads in Kenya left something to be desired, to say it best. One time I was wearing a Fitbit watch and went on a 4-hour drive, and at some point partway through, my watch started buzzing. It thought I had done 10,000 steps and it was rewarding me. And I had been sitting, but it was like this on the road. Rwanda, Kigali had amazing roads. And as we're driving down, there's this whole crew working on some roadworks, and we saw some laborers were Rwandans, but the rest were Chinese. A lot's in suits and hard hats, right? And I was like, so they're doing work, but they're not creating jobs in the way that you would hope would happen with local economy. So originally it seemed that the way China was benefiting economically from these relationships, Africa was getting infrastructure. But as you can see more recently, Africa is also not only buying goods from China, they're selling goods to China. So they're getting more markets for their goods as well. Primarily a lot of the natural resources that China needs for its burgeoning population and its own economic development. But at least China's buying them and not stealing them, right? Colonialism, we're like, we need those resources for our industrialization. We're just gonna enslave you, control you, and steal your stuff. China's not doing it directly that way. Although one of the things they mentioned in the film, the idea of racism. So anecdotally, people I know in Rwanda and in Kenya, where China is doing a ton of work, Chinese people tend to be racist towards Black Africans. And I have a rule, if you go to Africa, you can't not like Black people. That's like the rule I made up after I started going to Africa and met way too many Westerners, Chinese people, you name it, who were in Africa and would say ridiculously bad things about Black people and Africans. So Africans are experiencing, and that was supposed to be a little bit sarcastic, so feel free to laugh. Are experiencing the racism that the film talked about with the Chinese labor that's coming in. So there's going to be some sociocultural things playing out over the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. And I didn't like the one guy, and I'm forgetting his name, who at one point early in the film was like, we can compete with China economically in sub-Saharan Africa. Then later in the film, he's like, we don't need to compete. We should work together. I'm like, but 10 minutes ago, you said compete. I don't know that that's the right goal. Because if the United States is trying to stay the global hegemon and thinking about how to compete with China, the African proverb, when elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers. If we're looking at our role in Africa primarily as how do we stay ahead of China as the global hegemon, we're not going to be making policies in ways that benefits African people, African states. And while China is not doing perfectly in all of its relationships with Africa, and as an international relations theorist, I'm much more of a realist. Every state does what's in their own best interest. This is not just the US or China, but there is a way to do it where you see some collaboration and benefit from the states in question. And the US and China, I think, need to think more about that, because Africans are not children and African states are not, even if there is a new economic scramble for Africa happening, it's not the same context, right? There are African states modeled after the Western rational idea of states. And African leaders have a say in how this scramble plays out and in how those relationships happen. And like in Kenya, they rebuilt the railroad, which they mentioned in the film. Prior to China coming in and investing in that railway,
I would never have taken it. Most of my friends in Kenya did not take the railway because it fell off the tracks all the time. We joked, we're pretty sure it was the exact same rail line that Karen Blixen took, if you've read or seen Out of Africa, right, during the colonial period. Once they redid it, now it's one of the best way to get to and from Nairobi, the capital, and the coast, where Mombasa is, which is the major port city. So you get lots more goods and services coming on the train, as well as people for tourism, without having to use just the semi-trucks, the lorries, right? Although they've also helped fix the road so you can get the lorries back and forth more easily, more quickly, etc. So it's a huge bust that needed to happen. So one of the books I read in preparation from this is by Dambisa Moyo. So who's a Zambian Harvard-trained economist, and she wrote a book recently on China and the US and Africa, and that the primary thing China is focused on is commodities, right? So they need markets for their goods, which they're finding. They need resources for their own people and economic growth. And so these commodities are a huge part of why China is in sub-Saharan Africa. Everything from all of the things listed on that map that we want, so does China. And so China obtains about 1/3 of its oil imports from African countries, right? So we know Nigeria, the Sudan, Angola are all major oil exporters, but even countries like Kenya have now found oil and are participating in that market. And one of the things that we're seeing with that is countries that already have a more stable, diversified economy, and then find something like oil or a mineral, diamonds, right? These high demand commodities, which can tend to create an economic resource curse, they're not having that curse experience because it's not the only thing they're dependent on, but it is a good component to their economy, right? So it mentioned that 5 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world are African states. Kenya is one of those. And that addition of oil and some other infrastructure projects are part of why Kenya is growing, and China is stepping into that and saying, we'll trade with you on oil. We need your oil. 35% of its manganese and 30% of its tantalum minerals that go into different items that we all buy globally. And yet, most recently, so I'm skipping over some stuff, it talked a lot in the film about the role of infrastructure. And about 2 weeks ago, China and states in sub-Saharan Africa had their 8th meeting of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation in Dakar, Senegal. And there was a major shift in focus by China. So the report that came out, and I don't have it memorized, I'm going to read from this. So China-Africa relations, the FOCAC has set China-Africa relations for about the last 20 years, and they set about 3-year goals with them. The theme this time was, quote, deepen China-Africa partnership and promote sustainable development to build a China-Africa community with a shared future. The shift in China's priorities was a quantitative reduction in their financial commitments overall from $60 billion to $40 billion. So their last convention like this, they said for 3 years, we're going to put in $60 billion into sub-Saharan African states. They're promising from 2021 to 24, only 40 billion. So they're reducing some of their monetary project commitments. And the most significant change qualitatively has to do with change in how they're going to do agricultural assistance, climate, environment, health, peace, security, and trade promotion. For capacity building, educational training opportunities have decreased from 50,000 government scholarships and training opportunities to 10,000 for each, right? So the film talked about China as this leading place for students to go and study. They're reducing the number of state-given scholarships for that by 4/5, from 50,000 scholarships down to 10,000, and same 10,000 training opportunity, or 50,000 down to 10,000. And they're shifting away from infrastructure. So the most striking element of the change is the complete disappearance, quote, of infrastructure from their narrative. Indeed, throughout the keynote speech that was given by China about the direction they were going to head, the word infrastructure didn't appear even once. In 2018, that was one of their leading focus areas, but that's not going to be the case. So who knows exactly how that's going to unfold and look. But that has been the primary way China's been working in sub-Saharan Africa, is through infrastructure. And now that's going to be a change. And a lot of what they think is fueling this is debt sustainability issues. There's a huge balance of payments issues between African states through some of their agreements with sub-Saharan Africa and African states and China, excuse me. And China is aware of that, how both visually and economically that could have an impact. This trade imbalance and the debt that it's creating could hurt African states' abilities to buy Chinese commodities, and China needs those markets. So they're kind of backing up and rethinking their strategy in part on that. Obviously, the COVID-19 crisis and shipping and supply chain that we're all experiencing, so are sub-Saharan African countries. And then, recently there's been some very visible issues between China and some of the projects that they've undertaken. Any of you see in the news about the Entebbe airport in Uganda? My student, what happened, Sian?
Can you make sure you repeat
Sure.
the question?
That they're not going to take over, but that's as much as I know about it. Yeah.
Okay, I can repeat what she said. Sorry. That China gave a loan to help rebuild the Entebbe airport in Uganda. And Uganda is somewhat defaulting on its ability to pay its loans on time, partly because of the pandemic and the trade imbalance and not getting the foreign capital it needs to make loan payments. So part of the agreement of the loan was that if they defaulted to a certain extent, China would take over the airport. So now China is saying we're going to take over the airport, and there was a global pushback on this, and China's like, no, that's not really going to happen. So there's sort of this back and forth in the media on whether or not that's going to happen, but that is some of the vulnerability with the terms of the agreements on some of the infrastructure projects. There was also a potential seizure of Kenya's Mombasa port because of similar kinds of issues with port investment that China had made. And there's huge debt repayment issues between Zambia and China. So these controversies around how some of the debt trap that the US Secretary mentioned are actually playing out and causing China to rethink some of how it's working in sub-Saharan Africa. Yeah, so it says, as Beijing is sensitive about the large trade deficit that Africa runs, the press conference for the Chinese Ministry of Commerce tried to portray China and Africa trade as mostly balanced in the past 2 decades, with $1.2 trillion in imports from Africa, 1.27 trillion in exports to Africa. However, the numbers game conveniently disguises the huge trade imbalance that actually exists. In 2019, just the year prior to the pandemic, China's trade surplus against Africa was $17.7 billion, with 113 billion in Chinese exports and 95.5 billion in Chinese imports. And in 2020, the imbalance grew 243%. So this worry about the trade imbalance, both its optics and its impact on Chinese markets, Beijing is beefing up its efforts to try to help get the trade balance aligned by doing things like quicker inspection and quarantining of products as they come in, more products with zero tariffs, et cetera. So if we think about the United States relationship with with sub-Saharan Africa, and if China is saying we need to reduce some of these different barriers and issues to improve trade, that's the one thing the United States hasn't done and hasn't really been willing to consider. So I kind of felt like telling the people in the film who were like, wow, look at all the money we gave for healthcare and it's on page 4 of the newspaper. That's in a context of how the United States and Western countries have treated sub-Saharan Africa for 70 years or longer, really. And so the US hasn't been willing to say, we see you as an equal trading partner, and we're willing to work with you on equal footing. And we recognize that you have certain commodities you could bring to market, and we're creating an unfair playing field, right? Doesn't matter that the World Trade Organization says all countries should reduce trade barriers as much as possible. And we say we believe in free markets. We don't actually do that when it comes to global trade with Africa. So we're willing to give aid. So with one hand, we're like, here, we'll give charity. We'll write songs by pop stars and raise money to help with famine and whatnot. But with the other hand, we're going to take by doing things like subsidizing our own commodities that are some of the primary goods Africa could bring to market. Cotton, maize, flowers, things like that, that keep African states from actually gaining market share and actually being able to industrialize and do value added with some of those goods, right? Like Ghana produces fabulous cocoa, but we help subsidize both through our private way that Nestle functions as a corporation and through tariff and non-tariff barriers. We keep Ghanaian cocoa companies from becoming Ghanaian cocoa processing plants where they're not just selling raw cocoa, they could sell the chocolate bar or the value added things up the chain. We have that market share and we do things to keep African companies from gaining it, right? And so some of the competition, if we're doing it with China, is we have to look and say, they're not doing some of those same things that keep African commodities out of the markets. The last thing I'll say, and then we can have a question time, is I have experienced and seen some of the good and bad in the ways that China is impacting Africa. I mentioned the railroad in Kenya, which is much better now. And yet the Entebbe airport issue. In Kenya, when I first started going there in the late 90s, you could get fabulous Kenyan made things like flip-flops that would be a composite of Kenyan rubber and plastic. As far as I know, Ken Poly, the plastic corporation, is still Kenyan owned. I think it's Indian Kenyan owned, but it's domestically owned. The rubber industry has almost entirely been replaced by Chinese imported rubber. Right. And so I have a pair of flip-flops, which you wear flip-flops all the time. Those of you who've been to sub-Saharan Africa, they are like gold because like in showers and whatever, Kenyans don't go barefoot. I still have the same pair from the late 90s that I got the first time. When I've gone back, I like would buy more just because they're rainbow colored and really cute. And they would wear out very quickly. And I learned that by the pairs I started to get that would wear out quickly were now made by Chinese composite material, and they were less high quality. And so Kenya has lots of goods that are coming in from China that they might not otherwise have as far as electronics, cell phones, things like that. But as one of my friends says, you can get the higher quality stuff from China, especially electronics, but they cost way more in Kenya than they would even imported here. The stuff that they put at a price point most of us can afford is the bottom end of the market kind of quality. And he said, and this is an anecdotal story, but he said they produce for Africans, which is, he meant in a very pejorative way, that the Chinese see us as less than, and so they make crummy quality stuff at a price point that we can afford. And that's been some of the same ways. And some of this is on the African states, like the roads, rebuilding the roads. One of the main roads that got redone, Mombasa Road, runs all the way from Mombasa to the middle of Kenya. And between Nairobi and Naivasha, which is another away from the coast city that has to get goods from the port, within a couple years of it being redone, where it no longer had potholes, you could literally put a small car in. It was redone. It was beautiful. You saw car wrecks go way up because people were driving so fast on it, not having to swerve around potholes. Within about 2 years, there were huge divots in the road. Part of that was because the lorries, the semi trucks, were allowed to be overweight. If they paid a bribe, they could have too much stuff in them. But part of it was because they cut corners on how much, and I'm not a road builder, so I won't know the right words, but pavement, tar, etc. they put down, right? And the road was partly built by Chinese corporations. Some of that is on the Chinese corporation, but some of it is on Kenya and the bribe system and the government cutting corners to make some of the money that they got in the grants. So I think in thinking about China's role in Africa, there has to be a recognition that African states have efficacy and are part of the story of how China plays out in sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, that's all I wanted to say. Questions?
We don't currently have anything.
Folks, please, before you ask a question, let me bring you the mic, because we have solved the Zoom classroom mic situation. So if you speak into the mic, Zoom will hear you. You can take your mask off when you talk, and that way we don't have to have the presenter repeat the question. I don't know, Susan, do you have anybody in chat that you want to start out with?
I don't have anything in chat, but why don't you do this? after you ask a question in the class or a few questions, why don't you go ahead and speak into the mic and ask the people at home if somebody wants to, just give them an opportunity to unmute themselves. So if you're in the Zoom classroom, you will have an opportunity and you can use chat if you want, but right now, go ahead and ask the question in the classroom.
Susan, I don't know how to stop sharing this and put it back on the classroom.
I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing it for you. I'm getting better at this.
I wasn't going to ask a question. I was just going to make a comment. Please. But I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Sierra Leone in West Africa from 1974 to 76. And at that time, there were several, already was seeing evidence of the Chinese work in Africa. In Sierra Leone, they were working in rice production, and there was several, I guess they were calling, the local Africans were calling Chinese rice farms, because like you said, it was primarily Chinese nationals coming into Sierra Leone, living in the area and building these huge rice paddies and farming the rice. And it wasn't so much the Sierra Leonean, they weren't really teaching the Sierra Leoneans to do a better job of farming rice. They were sort of more building the rice paddies themselves and operating them. Yeah.
They're just using the land and space. Yep.
I'm interested from an economic perspective, how the United States would lend money to Africa versus how China lends money to Africa. And is it because of the potential forfeiture of the loan that Africans tend to go to China first rather than America because of the liability?
So I don't know for sure that they go to China first, so that they're leaning that direction more. Going back, and you're probably familiar with this, right? To the one economist mentioned in the 90s, it was really more started in the 80s, I think, where we came in with sort of a laissez-faire economics to replace the 60s and 70s Keynesian economic focus that was said. We came in after World War II with the Marshall Plan, rebuilt Europe and partly Japan with a certain way of doing things economically. And we're like, great, we know how to do this. Now we're going to do it in these newly independent states in sub-Saharan Africa. So we took the same model and applied it to a completely different context. And shockingly, when you mixed in the Yom Kippur Wars and the oil crisis and then the debt crisis, it didn't work. And so the way that the international financial institutions kind of ran things was saying, since we know how to do this because it worked in Europe, we're going to have the state run the economy and you're going to grow. And within 10 years, you'll all be where we are. And that didn't work. And then the Cold War started and all these other different ideological things came into play. And we said, okay, you got to take the state out of the market and you got to free your markets. And so they said you had to adjust the structure. And well, Mexico almost went bankrupt. And when Mexico said we're going to go bankrupt, the world's like, oh, this is bad. Like a number of African states and Latin American states are like, we're having trouble paying these loans. And the international financial institutions are like, sorry to hear that. We need you to pay your loans. When Mexico, this very large economy, very close to the United States, said, we can't pay these loans. We're like, wait, we don't really want anyone to go bankrupt. We will keep lending to you. We will redo the terms of your loans, but you have to adjust the structures of your government and your economy for us to do that. So the Washington Consensus, as it was called, came up with these structural adjustment programs that then became the conditions on all loans from the early 80s forward. And they were very like free market driven. They had to reduce the size of their bureaucracies, remove tariffs, et cetera. And so since the early 80s, there've always been these conditionalities on you have to run your state and your economy the way we want you to for you to lend. And then in the early and mid 90s, we started post-Cold War when we no longer would just support anybody who said they weren't supporting the USSR. We said, oh, by the way, and you have to be pursuing democracy and good governance. So there's all these within they now don't call them structural adjustment programs. They're poverty reduction strategy plans. They are marginally improved, the IFI's programs than were the structural adjustment programs, but still have all of these conditionalities of you play our way and we'll give you money. China came in and said, we don't care if you're a democracy or not. If you want to have tariffs, barriers, and trade barriers, we did, go for it. But we're willing to lend to you and we're willing to trade with you without any of these kind of conditionalities. You want to gas all your people or whatever, we're okay with that because we do the same thing. So I think it's more so that lack of requirements than a concern of knowing that they're going to default on the loan or not. It's more that, and China definitely, because they've been in Africa for so long as well, kind of playing this more partnership role of like, we are not a global power the way the US, we've been oppressed as well. Look at all of our history with the different dynasties and invasions. Like we're on the same team as you as sort of a global player, and we'll give you money and we'll help build your infrastructure, and we're not going to require the same kind of things. Although the debt trap he mentioned to me is a type of conditionality that's coming into play when they're like, oh, you can't pay for the airport in the middle of a pandemic when you're not getting the goods to market that you need to, we're going to take it over. Becomes almost a literal economic colonialism that they're getting a lot of pushback for this year. Yes, sir. Oh, wait, microphone's coming.
I spent a lot of time in African studies at Michigan State.
Go green.
In the 70s. And one of the focuses of African studies then was the impact of the Cold War and neo-colonialism on these emerging African states. And only the players then were the US and Russia. But the scenario was really very similar. And I just wonder if you can comment on any differences between what happened then in the 60s and what's happening now in the early part of this century.
Sure. I think there's lots of similarities. Economic more than militarily would be a difference. Right, in the Cold War, any of the non-aligned states who said, we're a democracy, we support democracy, yay America, got guns and money. And any state that was like, yay USSR, communism and socialism probably work, got guns and money. Just the provider was different. So how is it different? It's not just guns and money without, indiscriminately. Also, China's just very different than Russia. I mean, obviously culturally and things like that, but I think they are competing with the US for global hegemony. I also teach political geography and we're studying like who might be the next global hegemon. China is a strong player. So I think that's there. But I think China has a much more, like I said at the start, long game vision. So they're not going to come in with the intensity that the Cold War was. So I think the sort of the economic piece is less intense than the weapons stockpiling and the space race and the nuclear possibilities, right? It's more of this like creeping growth. Also, though, African states are in a different place, right? The first African state gained independence in 1957. So by the huge ramp up of the Cold War in 62, 63, all but a couple of African states had independence. So they were all really new. And now they've had independence for mostly 60, 70 years and are at different places in their economic and political stability, development. You have some really growing economies. You have, African innovation that's driving things in the world. So very proud of Kenya. M-Pesa was the first mobile money app developed globally. And things like Venmo are modeled off of Kenya's mobile money. And so that's, to me, the African states are leading the way in certain things. So I think even this economic competition and with China taking over things on the ground competition is going to look different because African states have more efficacy and more ability to be setters of the tone of the terms of trade in terms of agreement than they did in the late 50s and early 60s.
Virginia?
Yes.
I'm on
Hi,
Zoom.
how are you?
Hi there. Question for you. Several occasions you've mentioned, as has the video, being in it for the long haul or over decades. So let's look over the next 3 decades when there are goals that have been set for the emission numbers to get them to zero, and what that effect that will have on the whole dynamics of what's happening in Africa when you've got countries that are trying to develop much like the China model, but might be thwarted by some of the goals that have been set for global emissions. And will that align them even further with China, which has benefited up to this point from all they've done and the investment in infrastructure in Africa? Some of it has been actually, if you look at coal burning and steel production, et cetera, that produce a lot of emissions. So will the whole addressing of the climate crisis exacerbate some of the challenges in Africa, and it will bring them closer to China or not?
That's a great question. And I think just following the most recent climate conference that happened about a month ago or whatever, if the US doesn't look at the climate issue as part of its relationship with sub-Saharan African states, I think that you're right, that it will send African states more into alignment with China, because we are still not, the North-South debate on climate change and whose responsibility is it to reduce emissions and help pay for that. It keeps going on kind of exhaustively the same way. And I think until the North recognizes that in order for African states to climb out of poverty, they have to, in some capacity, industrialize. And if we want them to do it in a way that doesn't pollute the way we did, they're going to need help, and they're going to need a lot of help. And not just USAID grants, but corporations like Google and Amazon going in and saying, we're going to pay twice as much to build one of our factories in Nigeria as we paid to build in Columbus, Ohio, because we're going to build it as green as possible. Right. So it's going to be that kind of investment from the North that's going to have to happen. Or they'll be like, we'll just work with China because they pollute to high heaven and aren't willing to stop polluting. And, so yeah, I think that's going to be a huge part of the direction of those relationships.
Well, and further to a challenge will be perhaps the Great Migration caused by the heating up of along the equator. And will China accept those who are trying to migrate, for example, given the video and what's happening in parts of China in accepting people from Africa, as well as other parts of the world that are going to have to accept those that are migrating because they can no longer live in that part of the world?
Yeah, I don't think China's going to be any more magnanimous than we've been, and I think that's going to be an issue. It was really kind of disgusting to see how, especially true, like refugees fleeing their countries and people, places like us saying we're not taking them, and you've got, Austria doing better than the United States when we have more land and we have the data to prove that immigrants actually improve our economy and don't commit any more crime than a natural born citizens do, right? But no, I don't think China's ready for a multicultural country. Right? They try to pretend that they're all like Mandarin speaking, same race, same ethnicity when they're not, and they oppress their current Chinese minority population. So I don't think they're going to be wide open borders to Africans.
Thank you.
We've always thought that economies are based on land ownership, and you've got all the land in all these African countries. Is it foreigners that are owning it, or are there Africans that own it?
So it varies by country. If you're interested in land and land reform issues, there's been a ton written on South Africa. And I know Kenya the best. Under their most recent constitution from 2010, it is almost impossible for a foreigner to own land. There's communal property, private property, and public property. So public would be like the government owns this and puts the city hall on it or whatever. Most property in Kenya is some kind of either public communal mix. So you can own the house, but you don't own the land that it's sitting on. which makes security of like that collateral really difficult. People that do own their own land and build a house on it, there's another complication that under the new constitution, there was the like Ministry of Lands, but at the same time, they finally passed in the same year a Comprehensive Land Act. And the Ministry of Lands and the Land Act give two different bodies the power to issue title deeds, which they did in spades to people. And so you've got Joe and Jill who both show up like with a title deed to the exact same parcel of land, never mind the people who've been displaced 3 or 4 times from that land because of colonization and post-electoral violence and all of this, who were like, we don't care who has the piece of paper, my people own that land and we're gonna hurt you if you don't move off of it. So land in Kenya is the largest issue. They've tried to do some land reform to make land be the kind of wealth, investment, commodity, et cetera, in South Africa that it is here with better success, but it's very complicated. So it's different, it differs by country, but for most of them, they've made it increasingly difficult for foreigners to own the land. Because they can't, right, either they can't afford it or the government, even if you have a title deed, like when Moi was president, he wanted to build a university, they just came and displaced all the Kenyans on that land. I was evaluating a water group in 2009, and we went to talk with the people living around Moi University about their water issues because we thought we're going to partner with Moi and we'll help improve water access and quality around the university. They didn't want to talk to us because we were with Moi University because they hated the university because Moi took, they're like, it's on our land. So even if you own it, you don't necessarily own it. Eminent domain repayments aren't very strong there.
The video mentioned that the 5 of the fastest growing economies were in Africa, and you mentioned Kenya. Can you tell us what the other 4 countries are that, or am I putting you on the spot?
Totally should know. Don't remember at the moment.
Okay.
If I had to guess, I
up.
would put like Nigeria, Ghana, South Africa, Botswana, all at the top there. But Kenya's probably still behind Nigeria and South Africa, but they're growing faster. So as far as 5 fastest growing, I would have to look it up.
Is there any sentiment in Africa that we don't need foreigners' money, that we can handle our own problems? Or is there a feeling that, gosh, we just got to have other people's help to take care of our issues?
So I can answer that more anecdotally than empirically, and I've experienced both. I mean, governments still want some kind of relationship, especially given, I mean, if you watch any documentaries or do interviews with government leaders, we live in a globalized world, and to have access to markets. So in that sense, you have to have access to markets to succeed. So in that sense, African states want, for lack of a better phrase, foreigners' money because they want the trade. They want to be part of the global system. Some recognize that, you know, I mentioned Mbisa Moyo earlier, her famous book was Dead Aid. And she basically argued all aid to Africa in the form of things like USAID and IMF and whatever needed to stop immediately. And her argument was a public goods argument, that it's replacing the accountability of states from having to provide public goods. Because instead of working off tax dollars and having to build infrastructure and actually be responsible to citizens, they're getting all their money from the international financial institutions, and therefore they're accountable to them, and it's propping up corrupt and ineffective states, right? They're not building the roads, the IMF's building the roads or whatever. And some African leaders and citizens would agree with her, and some would say, okay, yeah, but there are things that foreign money is doing that's helping. For example, one of the best programs for AIDS in the world is the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, or PEPFAR, which many of you have probably heard of. It was started under the Bush administration. Had some problems in how the rollout happened, whether or not we could use generics or only things made by American companies, et cetera. They got that worked out. And I've gotten to see PEPFAR distribution happen, and you see a clinic full of people that you know are all HIV positive, except for maybe a sniffle or a cough. They all seem very healthy, right? Because they have access to antiretrovirals. And that money just, people were dying and that money just wasn't going to come magically poof out of nowhere. And so I'd say there's probably both sentiments that Africans are not children. We don't need the West competing and trying to set, like he said, competing for economic influence. So not just competing for markets, but competing for economic influence. I would say any African leader I've met, or even your average citizen, would be like, you don't need to influence us. Like, we know what we're doing. We have trained, educated economists and politicians and whatever. And then there would be others that say, yeah, but until we catch up, we're never going to catch up without some kind of foreign capital coming in different ways. We just really appreciate it if you did it in ways that respected us as equals.
Hi.
Hi.
So there was a report done by US intelligence, and it found that China is planning to install a military base in Equatorial Guinea. So how do you think this will impact Equatorial Guinea's economic loyalties to China and overall economic situation, if at all?
The latter, overall economic situation, I have no idea. It could help if it creates spillover jobs, like even if they're bringing in Chinese troops, right? They're going to buy from local restaurants and stuff. So there could be some positive gain, at least for the area where the base is built on that. Their relationship, I think, will become 100% solidified if there's a military base right there with the PRC's army taking up residence. But there's also a context, right? Equatorial Guinea is interesting. I had not studied it. So in my African politics class, all of my students follow one country all semester. So 1 week we're studying democracy. They have to look at what's the experience with my country with democracy, et cetera. One student did Equatorial Guinea a number of years ago, knew really nothing about it, and found out that the leadership there, they have basically two main ethnic groups. One was larger than the other, and the head of the one ethnic group became president and basically tried to exterminate the other ethnic group entirely. So mass ethnic cleansing. So it's not like the historical leadership of Equatorial Guinea is very like democratic and human rights focused anyway. So I think they've had a natural, and you could look this up later if you want, natural relationship with China because they've wanted to be more autocratic. So I think that will solidify it if they're building a military base there. Good question. We just all smile at each other while we wait on the microphone to move.
I'm wondering if food production is a part of the equation. Is that something that China is interested in? Is the commodities
for themselves
as a commodity for themselves?
Absolutely. Right. Getting things like maize and grains and rice out of sub-Saharan Africa, or maybe not rice, but maize and other things that they don't produce to feed their growing population, maybe even rice for the urban areas.
So
absolutely.
That is one of the commodities they're after.
Yeah.
They need.
Yeah. So they want to be leaders in tech. China already is, and they are not able to produce enough of the different things like coltan and whatever that go into computers. So they're trying to get that from Africa, but also food and stuff to keep their populations. Food, oil, and minerals, I think, are the primary three.
Okay. Thank you.
I always say, don't talk about politics and religion, but
feel free.
We've always sent missionaries to Africa,
Mm-hmm.
and we've always sent work groups to Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And you always end up with that conflict. Are we better off sending resources to Africa for the Africans to use, or are we better off providing the labor similar to what China does and does things for the Chinese or for the Africans?
Uh-huh.
So what's the work ethic like of Africans to actually do the work themselves once they're trained?
Same as the work ethic of people anywhere in the world. One thing that I've always hated, and every president says it, even Obama, I wanted to smack him. We have the best laborers in the world. We have a work ethic that surpasses people anywhere in the world. No, we don't. We're all humans. And in my perspective, we're all humans created in God's image. And some of us are lazy and some of us are industrious. And that's the same anywhere in the world. And my experience with people that I've worked with in sub-Saharan Africa, they do things that some of my friends here would just never do. I mean, I was telling Larry beforehand, I complained for 4 hours in 10 minutes when I was pacing a marathon once and it poured rain the whole time, but I was doing my hobby, right? I had a person who's my age mate, and this was in 2002 when I lived in Nakuru for 6 months as an intern. She got up at 4 a.m. She did 4 jobs before she got to the missionary family I was living with's house to take care of their kids all day at 8 a.m. Right? She like helped her husband with his mandazi factory, which is like these really good puff donuts. She tended 2 shambas. She made deliveries to little shops that were going to sell stuff on the side of their, all before 8 a.m. And we were 24. Then she came and did laundry by hand, including ironing my undergarments, which I always told her she didn't have to do, but that's what she did. And played with these kids all day. And I love children, but playing with them all day to me sounds exhausting. And then she walked home, and I remember one day it was pouring rain when Alice was leaving, and we lived in the hills in Nakuru. So just think red dirt soaking wet, right? And I was like, I'm sorry you have to walk in the rain. She's like, no, we need the rain. My vegetables in my garden grow because it rains. And I was like, oh my gosh, like you're a better person than me, right? And yet I would never want to say like, oh yeah, Kenyans, they're all so industrious. That's very noble savagizing. Like some are like Alice and some are not. And so the work that needs to be done by Africans in Africa, there are Africans that can do it and will do it.
Folks, Dr. Beard has got a tight schedule after 2:30. So I think we could take one more question from the audience.
I've got a
over
question.
Zoom. Jim, you want to take the last question on Zoom?
Yeah, if you don't mind, that'd be great. My question is more of a personal nature. My family, I'm intending to take my entire family over to Kenya and Tanzania in the next year or two on safari. Should I feel safe doing so, both medically and otherwise? You know, I'd like your comment about that. It's, you know, we're sitting here debating what's the right thing to do.
So I just got back from Kenya 2 weeks ago. I would feel absolutely safe medically or otherwise. If you plan well, if you're working through, if you've never been to East Africa, it helps to have a travel agent or someone on the ground who can kind of help you navigate and perceive what you're seeing. But as far as medically, people there were much better about masking. I had to wear a mask outside walking in the heat. And I had to be tested before I went, when I got there, when I left. And they had a clinician who you could book who would come to your hotel or hostel to do the COVID test for exit. So I think it would be, I think it'll be great. And because I think East Africa has a more communal culture, when they're saying you need to wear masks and get vaccinated if you can, because we all need to be protected, people weren't like, oh no, my rights. People were wearing masks and doing what they needed to do.
What about Tanzania?
I've never been to Tanzania, but I would assume that it's about the same as far as how things are going there. And the rates of infection of COVID, even in the slum that I was in, were really low. The highest rates were in areas where there were more tourists and expats mixing around than in the very crowded slum. And I can't explain that, but that was the case.
That's been very helpful. Thank you.
Have a good trip.
On behalf of HASP, Dr. Beard, thank you very much. I think we all need more insights on, especially China, and in this case, China and Africa. So thank you again very much.
You.
Yes, we thank you from everyone.
If any of you are big readers, I got this book to help in preparing. I'm not 100% done with it, but it's called China and Africa Between Imperialism and Partnership. And it's by 2 African scholars. So I think that would be the best book I've found recently.
What's the date?
The date? Oh, that would matter. It's recent, I think. 2021. So it might even have COVID stuff in it. I haven't read the last chapter, so. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead and close the class. Everybody have a wonderful afternoon.